I'm honored and most humbled by my presence in this hall amongst lawyers, practitioners, diplomats, and activists who work towards the betterment of women's lives on a day-to-day basis. I had a pretty long speech that I've slashed to bits and pieces, so if there are parts that need to be linked, you will do that. But I think in the interest of time and to hear all the speakers, I will keep this short. I have been asked to speak about how culture operates to control and subordinate women. I sit here in front of you as a woman, a feminist, a scholar, activist, and a theorist who's been working towards a better understanding of violence against women, which is one of the most tolerated and neglected violations of human rights. Is this because women are not humans? Or is it the assumption that women, some or all, have been referred to by their inclusion in the term men? This inclusion is not just a matter of linguistic simplicity or convenience, but an inclusion that is political and cultural in nature with extremely grave consequences. Cultural and social norms that trigger, support, and perpetuate violence are innumerous and are grounded in the falsehood of women being included when we say men, and that women are a part and parcel of men, or more crudely, that the physical, emotional, and psychological assets of women are the property of men with an ownership that entitles the men in patriarchal societies to make women's lives, the bad, loose, out-of-control women like me who defy cultural norms, hell. Some cultural and social norms leading to oppression and violence against women, all of which are about control, are: a man has a right to assert power over a woman and is socially superior. A man has a right to correct or discipline female behavior. A woman's freedom should be restricted. Physical violence is an acceptable way to resolve conflicts within a relationship. Intimate partner violence is a taboo subject. Divorce is shameful. A woman is responsible for making a marriage work. Sex is a man's right in a marriage. Girls are responsible for controlling a man's sexual urges. Sexual activity is a marker of masculinity. Sexual violence, such as rape, is shameful for the victim. Outrageous. Outrageous as all these norms may be, they exist in some, or let's say all parts of the world, of this patriarchal world that we live in. These norms, based on the heteronormativity of gendered constructions, trap victims in double binds and symbolic cages that represent oppression, often grounded in justifications of culture. FGM is justified, breast ironing is justified, rape and battery within or outside marriages is justified or to an extent normalized. How can we make sense of such justifications and their implication on women as victims of violence? Examples are manifold and my time slot is too short for me to iron out all those creases. What I can dedicate this talk to is to highlight the interlinkages, often very difficult to delineate, between three loaded and abusive concepts: violence, oppression, and culture. I can't talk about culture and the oppression and violence that culture brings without sort of linking these three terms together. I will make the case that culture oppresses women in unique ways that perpetuate the cycle of violence, making it very difficult to identify and take legal action against. Let's start with the concept of violence. It's a complex term that needs to be delineated before we're able to identify it correctly. Violence is made possible by the existence of power-gender relations. Violence and gender are mutually constitutive and are grounded in the public-private dichotomy. Male-female gendering thrives on violence, which incidentally does not occur in isolation, but is linked to men's violence against other men and to the internalization of violence, that is, a man's violence against himself. Gender is not only about women, and nor is feminism. There are three types of violence, broadly speaking, constituting what Galton calls the violence triangle. To understand how culture operates to control and subordinate women, one has to understand these intricate links between these different kinds of violence. These are structural violence, direct violence, and cultural violence. Quite clearly, cultural and structural violence cause direct violence, whereas direct violence reinforces the other two. Direct violence is visible, whereas cultural and structural violence are often invisible. There's also a basic difference in time. in terms of the relationship of these three concepts of violence. Direct violence is an event. Structural violence is a process with ups and downs. Cultural violence is an invariant of permanence in the big schema of time. This typology of violence is mandatory to understand because only the elimination of violence at all these three levels can lead to true peace. Peace, as it is, in patriarchy, is war against oneself. Let's go over all these three kinds of violence. Direct violence can be physical, emotional, verbal, institutional, spiritual, or religious, amongst many others. It may take many forms such as physical force, killing or torture, rape, sexual assault, beatings, verbal violence, and add all those layers of violence out there. Structural violence exists when violence is built into structures and shows up as unequal power, and consequently as unequal life chances. This unequal power distribution and thereby advantages are built into the social, political, and economic systems that govern societies, states, and the world. Patriarchy, cultural, structural, direct violence, the structural violence being patriarchy. Now, cultural violence is where I'm trying to get to. Cultural violence is the prevailing attitudes and beliefs that we have been taught since childhood that surround us in our daily lives about power and the necessity of violence, which I think we see a lot of in our day-to-day culture. It is important to clarify that often these are aspects of cultures, not entire cultures. Entire cultures can hardly be classified as violent. This is one reason for preferring the expression aspect A of culture C is an example of culture violence rather than culture C is violent. Cultural violence makes direct and structural violence look, even feel right, at least not wrong. Cultural violence is the explicit or tacit permission in law, custom, tradition, and religion for men to commit violence, often glamorized and rewarded. Consider customs such as breast ironing, female genital mutilation, sati, stoning, dowry, corrective rape, honor killings, and to name just a few to give you a sense of the tip of the iceberg that legitimize the use of violence by men and male-dominated institutions against women and non-hegemonic masculinities, often carried out by messengers of the patriarchal system who can be willing victims as well as carriers at the same time, and I think that's an important one to recognize. The core problem with cultural violence is that it is rooted in the justification of culture. A culture you were born and raised in, rules of the home, so to speak. Your options are to follow these norms as is expected of you or not. Shrouded in love and belonging, it's very easy to follow suit without questioning. To question these norms or not, both decisions come with devastating consequences. Following the norms implies willingly accepting the rules that lead to your own oppression. Not following or questioning these norms implies being ostracized, oftentimes, from the very family, community, or state that you're from, and that defines your social and political existence and location. This is referred to as a double bind, a signifier of oppressed people. Two additional nuances of cultural violence that are more global in character or not related to specific but all cultures need special mention. And I won't elaborate on those, but the first one would be the culture of silence, which is when people become so oppressed that they become silenced. They don't talk about their oppressions, and talking comes with serious consequences or repercussions that victims tend to avoid or stay out of. A second nuance is the cultural violence associated with a globalized world where the sexualization and objectification of women has spread worldwide to sometimes what we can call more traditional, or if you'd like, prudish, so to speak, cultures. Mixed and contradictory messages from the Western patriarchal media, the objectification and sexualization of women, versus the local, traditional, cultural patriarchy, have led to repercussions that have led to a rise in violence. So you have sort of the global Western patriarchy versus the traditional internal patriarchy, but the big P remains pretty much the same. It is no wonder that feminist scholars such as Maria Mies expose the intricate links between patriarchy and capitalism. Thus, to go back to the three kinds of violence, when we say violence against women, we're talking about an event, a structure, and a superstructure, all of which are patriarchal, heteronormative, violent, and oppressive in character. As a consequence of the entrapment of a victim in the triangle of these three types of violence, discussed above, victims feel and are oppressed. So the last term that I want to go over, the concept that I want to go over is oppression. Often oppression is not identified as oppression, as we often associate it with sort of an intent to oppress. We think of dictators and totalitarian regimes and fail to see democracies as arenas where oppression can also thrive. There are broadly 5 phases of oppression, which I'm not going to get into details of: violence, exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, and cultural imperialism. I want to expand on one critical aspect of oppression, the birdcage. Some of you who've heard me talk before probably know that's one of my favorite analogies. Cages. Consider a bird cage. If you look very closely at just one wire in the cage, you cannot see the other wires. If your conception of what is before you is determined by this myopic focus, you could look at that one wire up and down in length and be unable to see why a bird would not just fly around the wire anytime it wanted to go somewhere. It is only when you step back, stop looking at the wires one by one, microscopically, and take a macroscopic view of the whole cage that you can see why the bird doesn't go anywhere. And then you'll see all of it in a moment. It will require no great subtlety of mental powers. It's perfectly obvious that the bird is surrounded by a network of systematically related barriers, no one of which would be at least hindrance to its flight, but which, by their relation to each other, are as confining as the solid walls of a dungeon. Why don't oppressed women fight against their own oppression? Why don't women oppressed by their cultures do or say something about their cultures? Well, there's a reason to it. I know why the caged bird sings. You've probably all heard that one. Maya Angelou. The title of the book, in fact, comes from the 3rd stanza of Dunbar's poem Sympathy, in which I have changed all the masculines for feminines. It reads, "I know why the caged bird sings. Ah, me. When her wing is bruised and her bosom sore, when she beats her bars and would be free, it is not a carol of joy or glee, but a prayer that she sends from her heart's deep core, but a plea that upward to heaven she flings. I know why the caged bird sings." I myself have transcended several cultures in my life, still am, and that is my privilege and my struggle. The one thing that has followed me throughout all these cultures is patriarchy. Of course, that's been sort of my evil friend. The farther away I got from my culture, physically and figuratively, the more I could ask questions, the more I could question my adherence to norms, the more I could critique my culture and make choices that would never be options where I belonged. I can now pick and choose bits and pieces of any culture, shake them up in a bottle, and call it my own. I am not cultureless. I'm creating my own culture. The trade-offs for this identity without that fixed culture is that you lose the romanticism and of that nostalgic place in history you once called home, or the oppressive feeling that you once called love. You live in a free, happy exile. But then, home and love don't have to be oppressive, but then losing and gaining is all about happening at the same time. And losses of violence, even if it leaves you all alone in the whole wide world, is worth every bit of its fight for the flight to freedom.